I forgot to mention this quick stat, which I think is pretty remarkable. There are over 200 people here today, over 170 entrepreneurs, people coming from all over the country, and coming from international places as well, so the UK, Switzerland, Finland, Brazil, Australia. I'm not sure why, but glad you're here. Before I introduce the next speakers, I'd like to share with you a montage that introduces the next topic, which is idea and business model validation.
Yeah, so the process of going from the aha moment to realizing a business model took probably a year and a half, and included dozens and hundreds of conversations with all sorts of different people.
Our first model we had coming out was just, here's a product, let's do a classic medical device route. We'll go through physicians, we'll give it to patients. It made a lot of sense. Once we started talking to the payer communities, we realized that they were really almost our customer. It wasn't even necessarily the patient. They really had a big pain point here. This is the most expensive type of patient they're taking care of, and every year they're spending, in the B, a lot of dollars that go into this problem. So by working with them, we started revising how we were, who we were going to market to, who we were selling to, and now it's much more direct to the payer, and it's only come through these conversations. And I think that's so key, is continuing to talk to who is your actual customer and making sure that we're able to deliver a solution that meets their needs instead of a classic way, which we sort of stamped on our product in the beginning.
Go to your future customers. In our case, it's probably pharmaceutical companies who would love to have our products in their pipeline. So I spent a great deal with them and said, so look at our technologies. We have a novel therapeutic, we have a novel target, we have the companion diagnostic in those 3 different cancers. What would you like to see?
Don't forget that this is about people interacting with a product or a service within a setting. And likely that setting incorporates other people. So testing ideas early on around a medical device or a mobile health software, whatever it is, thinking this is going to live in the hands of people.
What's important is getting out of the building and getting access to those people who are very happy to lend advice for across the realm of considerations. And so it's really anything you can do to force yourself to get out in front of investors and entrepreneurs with that pattern recognition faster is going to allow you to learn faster.
And there's a certain process that I believe one needs to undertake involving sort of a staged rollout, in a sense, that you attempt to come to the best understanding of what the technology can provide and what the business model is. And then you stress test it in the real world with potential investors and potential customers, but do that gradually with perhaps some friendly faces before attempting some massive fundraising effort or commercialization effort.
Entrepreneurs that understand that there's this cognitive level, emotional level, and social contextual level, and can actually pressure test the ideas early on and improve them in those 3 dimensions, if you like, can more quickly understand that they're getting closer to an ultimate experience that should and will be successful not only in the medical side, but the social side and on the business side.
All right, before I ask Steve and Alex to join us to give a quick introduction. So Steve Blank, as a lot of you know, is a serial entrepreneur, prolific writer, blogger, known to sort of the best at cracking the code of entrepreneurship. Alex is the founder, entrepreneur himself of the Business Model Foundry and the creator of the Business Model Canvas. I've met them in September last year. This was the I-Corps' first program. Any of you here are familiar with the I-Corps program, the NSF's I-Corps program? So this is something quite remarkable. So the NSF spends about $5 to $6 billion in basic science research every year, and they've recently decided to think about how do we help some of the science we fund get to the market. Are there some is there some science in there that is commercially viable? And so they've reached out to the best, reached out to Steve Blank to come and start the first boot camp at Stanford. I was myself quite skeptical if you could actually teach academics to actually do entrepreneurship and go out there and try to grow a business. But I was just astounded at the sort of metamorphosis that I've noticed over just even a 3-day period of them using a canvas, having a crisper pitch in describing their business and their science, going out there and alerting and incorporating those findings into a new way of thinking about their business. So please welcome me and join me in welcoming Steve and Alex to the stage. Thank you.
Okay, I'll start, Steve, if that's okay. Okay. Maybe just a small comment. If I break down in front of you, there's an explanation for that. So Steve Blank and I were working on some stuff at Steve's ranch, and we had some time and we did a small life science experiment. We actually tested the expiry date of sushi. And I can now affirm that if there's that date written on sushi, don't go one day over it, okay? I can guarantee you it's a bad idea. I was the control. You picked the right role there. Okay, so let's see. I'm going to talk about designing business models, and at least 90 of you listened to the webcast when I was sitting in Switzerland talking about the business model canvas. Maybe the rest of you by now also know what the business model canvas is about, because you maybe watched the webcast. So I won't go more into that. I'll actually give you some sound principles of business model design. And then Steve will talk to you about, well, okay, you might have a business model that looks great, but is it going to work? Because after all, the only judge of your business model is the market, right? So even if you're the smartest person in science in your lab, well, you're probably not smarter than the market, than your customers. They know what they want, and you need to figure that out first. And you need to design a business model around that value proposition, channels, and so on. And that's tough work. That's not obvious. So let me start first just with this simple question. What is entrepreneurship? And for those of you who were in my little demo, you've seen that it's not about products that don't work when you demo them. But it happens. I mean, it's a tough journey, right? So some of you use this now to think about your business model. And the real difficult part of entrepreneurship is finding that scalable business model that works. And the tools for that were invented just the last couple of years. It's not the business plan where you put a lot of data, a lot of detail together and think, yeah, I'm smart, this is going to work. The more detail you add, the more you think it's going to work. Probably not. So I like to quote Steve here where he always says, no business plan survives the first contact with customers. So what we actually need is other tools, new tools, and the tools that work pretty well to figure out how can I find a scalable business model is this idea of business model design using a tool like the business model canvas in combination with customer development, Steve's approach about testing business model. It's those two together that will make your life easier, your entrepreneurship life easier. And they will probably prevent you from instant mortality when you start your startup. They can't guarantee success, but they will make your life a lot easier. So I'm not going to go much into the canvas in the explanation because we're going to use it. And I'm going to give you about 7 principles of sound business model design, okay? So those of you who are new to this should have done your homework. You should have watched the videos online. But this is a simple template, if you want, to sketch out your business model. The most important pieces, the 9 questions you need to answer to explain your business model. And as we've seen in the presentation before, what's really, really important here to understand is it's all about creating clarity and communicating, well, what is your business model? It's not just about the technology or the product you have, but it's about all the things together. Which customers are you targeting? How are you reaching them? Through which channels? How are you earning money? And what do you need actually to do that on the front stage? If you can't sketch out those 9 building blocks very clearly, people are not going to understand your business model. Investors won't understand. Employees won't understand. Maybe you won't even understand. And this is one of the things I've learned over the last couple of years using this, that people have better conversations when they use a visual language like this to discuss their business model. Because the moment you put up a sticky note to say, hey, this is my customer segment, everybody will see it. It's up there. It's clear. You can't hide behind fuzzy conversations. Okay? So let's go into this and ask ourselves, well, what is a good business model? I'll give you 7 hints, and then we'll see, okay, well, I got a great business model. What do I do with that now? So let's start with the first one. It's like, going to the doctor. He's going to assess your business model. We're going to assess business models in general. The first thing you want to look at when you build a successful business model, okay, let's just create the basis here. You do need to have a value proposition that fulfills a customer need. That's the start. If you don't have that, it's not going to work, right? But beyond that, you can build better or worse business models that allow you to exist longer, have higher profit margins, have a better competitive advantage. The first one, it's a pretty simple one, but often underestimated, is this idea of switching costs. How easy or difficult is it for your customers to switch? Now, I'll explain with an example. So, who of you has either an iPod or an iPhone at home? Either or, okay? It's the same image all around the world. Now, when Steve Jobs came up with Apple with the iPod, they had this great strategy around this great product. And when he presented, he said, this allows you to put 1,000 songs in a pocket. Some of you have seen the video, and he pulls out the iPod and says, 1,000 songs in a pocket. You'd say, wow, that's a pretty amazing product innovation. What you probably don't know is it was a much more sophisticated strategy that changed an entire industry, the industry of digital music players. Because before that, you could switch from one device to the other, because you could only put 24 songs. There was no switching cost. It was very easy for you as a customer to switch, right? But when they came up with 1,000 songs in a pocket, let me draw this, they created switching costs. So, because once you have 1,000 songs in your pocket, how easy is it to put them into a different device? It's very difficult, right? The same for apps in the App Store. So let me draw this, what you need to look at in your business model to figure out your switching costs. And we've seen the same thing with the example that we looked at in the online class about Nespresso. So here you have the iPod, and here you have the customer. Traditionally, there was no, if you look at this is the customer, the value proposition box, whoops, the customer segment box, and here you have customer relationships. It was very easy for customers to switch, correct? Because you just could go from one digital device to the other. Now, once they came up with 1,000 songs in a pocket, basically what they created was switching costs that locked you in, okay? It's a little lock. My visual thinking skills are not great. So when you design a business model, you want to figure out how can you design switching costs into your business model, because that's a very, very powerful thing. If you can show to your investors that there are switching costs designed into your business model, they're going to open their eyes. I guarantee you that. In particular, if you do that in an industry where there was no switching costs before, that's a very powerful thing to do. Now, this is a very basic one, but we often forget it. And again, you can think of that in the business model canvas. How can you create recurring revenues rather than just transactional ones? So remember this Nespresso example that we looked at online in the webcast? Well, you buy this machine, and Nespresso doesn't actually care about the revenues of that machine, because they're going to have recurring revenues from selling pods with coffee inside to you over time. So that's what we looked at. And what they did, so a little repetition, if you forgot this, they had an extremely smart business model strategy. What they did was that, have the canvas here. They said, you know what? We have two components to our value proposition. One is this machine that you just saw, and the other one is the pods with the coffee inside. We're going to sell these machines through our channels to the customers. But what we're really interested in is not this revenue stream here from the machines, but what we're really interested in is the recurring revenues coming from the pods. So in life sciences, this is a strategy that can be extremely interesting. I'm on the innovation board of a large European pharmaceutical company, and they're starting to understand that beyond developing drugs, they can start working with these really, really interesting business model strategies. So while you're coming up with your business model, you want to think these things through. Okay. So, what was the second question? Now let's look at the third one. And this one in life sciences, it's a pretty provocative one, because you spend a lot of money before you earn. Now, could you figure out a business model where you earn before you spend? And that's an interesting question, in particular in an industry where there are large upfront costs. Is it doable? Maybe. Maybe if you figure out the right business model to do that. So, small example, take one from myself, is when we wrote this book that is now global bestseller with about 350,000 copies around the world, we said, how could we use an innovative business model to produce this relatively expensive book? For a book, it was about, project $250,000. For a book, that's pretty expensive. Obviously not in life sciences. But how could we finance this before we sold the first copy? And we figured out a mechanism where online we created the book with a community of people around the world, and they would pay before we even wrote the first line. Because we understood customers and we knew that they wanted to participate in this global initiative of writing a management bestseller. So by understanding customers, we could figure out how we could earn money before spending. It's a very, very powerful business model design principle. So, next one. Game-changing cost structure. This is a very, very powerful one, in particular in industries like life science. So, let me draw this for a second. Go back. The example I want to look at is this one. Anybody have a clue who this is? Anybody know? Who's this guy? Zenström, right? Somebody said Bill Gates once in an audience. Not really. It's Niklas Zenström. What did Niklas do? Together with another guy called Janus Friis, they invented Skype after having invented Kazaa, which was an online file-sharing platform, which they sold because they realized they couldn't make money off of it. Then they invented Skype, and they turned it into, after a bit of a period of time, into a billion-dollar business. Now, what's interesting with Skype is they changed the cost structure of an entire industry. So, traditionally in the telecom industry, what's the most valuable asset that you have in the telecom industry? What's the network, right? So here you have the network. Okay, this would be an antenna, in case you didn't figure it out. So the costs here are enormous for building the network and maintaining the network. Zenström, he had this technology, peer-to-peer technology, to build Kazaa, this online file-sharing platform. What he did is he said, I have this great technology, let me look around which industry could I disrupt with peer-to-peer technology. And he figured out, with peer-to-peer, what I can do is here, in the telco industry, I can build a business model without a network. So he could create something that would allow you to make phone calls for free. Right? So there was a big part here that was free. And there was a part that was paid, and they started making $1 billion off that. Now, why am I showing this example? Because when they started out with this, I was in contact with the CEO of the biggest Swiss telco operator. It was a state firm. And we talked to him about Skype. We said, what do you think about Skype? He said, free? That's not possible. Because if you want to offer mobile communications or fixed line communications, you have huge infrastructure costs, right? We said that's the biggest asset. Costs a lot of money. What he failed to realize at that time is that other people came up with a totally different business model design with a totally different cost structure. So what you'll see more and more, and this could be interesting for yourself, is you'll see industries where you have different business models competing with very different economics. Now, challenge to you is, could you come up with something that has a totally different cost structure? It's not easy, but I promise you it's doable. So, this is my favorite one, getting others to do the work. Very, very powerful principle of business model design. So, wonderful example of somebody who got filthy rich by getting others to do the work is Zuckerberg with Facebook. Anybody have a clue why I'm putting this up? How did he get others to do the work? In the business model of Facebook, where are others doing the work?
Platform apps.
Platform apps could be one, just like Apple also has apps. The developers are doing the work. There's another. The like button is definitely one. It's even more basic than that, even before the link. It's just you and me, right? Putting this stuff on the platform. So while Facebook does build a platform, most of the value comes from the people who use Facebook, who put stuff on Facebook. So in terms of business model design, this one I really want you to keep in mind. See if I have some space here. It means that here, in the backstage part of your business model, here where you have key resources, you and I, who use Facebook, those who are on Facebook, they become a key resource because we create the content, right? Now, another example is in software. There's a company called Red Hat that is building their offering based on free software that's available on the internet. Linux-based software, right? An operating system. Now, how could they do that? They could do that because they add something into it in addition, which is offering companies a guarantee, a legal guarantee for that free software, which the free software itself doesn't do. So let me be provocative here. Could you imagine some kind of open source initiative in your domain where people work together, pool their stuff, create value for the world, and you build business models on top? Could that be possible? I think so. But it's all about business model design. So it's not just about the technology and the product, it's about going further. So, two more. Scalability. You want to think about business models that are scalable. So typically in life sciences, obviously, licensing is a very scalable business model. Making stuff and selling stuff is not always the most scalable thing. Or having services based on people is not always the most scalable thing. I'll give you an example coming here from the Bay Area. Zynga. Anybody heard of Zynga? Who's heard of Zynga? Okay. Zynga was, when they started out, small, right? But they took something into their business model design on the partner side, on the very left-hand side of the business model canvas, that turned them into an ultra-scalable business model. They said, okay, we need to be able to acquire a lot of users. How can we do that? We can spend a lot of marketing money, or we could be smart about it and work with a partner who has the biggest scale in the world already. So they decided to build their offering on top of Facebook. So they didn't build the scale, they actually integrated the scale of somebody else. They piggybacked on Facebook. So in your business models, you want to figure out how can you build a scalable business model. And the last one I'm going to talk about before I hand over to Steve to talk about how do you test the business models, your great design of your business model. The last one is protection from competition. We heard that before also. You want to be smart about your business model, and is it possible for others to copy it or not? What are the competitive barriers? And here, one of my favorite examples is the iPhone. What makes it so difficult for other phone manufacturers to reproduce the same kind of profits that Apple has with the iPhone? What would you say? Why is it so difficult? What's so difficult to copy? Is it the technology? Not really. Samsung phones are almost better, right? What is it? It's the apps. So in their business model, they designed something into it, which you call it, in the technical terms, a double-sided market. Now, I know I'm getting very conceptual here because I know that Steve is going to be very practical, but I want you to think about this. How can you go beyond technology and products to build sophisticated business models that differentiate and give you a competitive advantage? Okay? So if we take the iPhone, here you have this platform, right? Which is the iPhone. Well, and then you have you and me who use the iPhone. So we buy the iPhone. But what Apple designed into the business model was another group of people who built apps for the iPhone or the iOS platform, which are developers. So this is a geek here, okay, smiling. And today, the customers come to the iPhone not just for the iPhone itself, but for the 500,000 applications that are on that platform. And the developers come to the iPhone because they know that there are millions and millions of users on the other side of this so-called double-sided platform. So if you can start building powerful platforms like this, it's practically impossible for competitors to catch up just based on products. Those are very, very powerful mechanisms of business model design. Okay? So, go back. You want to look at your business models that you came up with. And for every technology, you can think of 3, 5, 10 different business models. But then you want to realize something that we don't always realize. We think, hey, we were so smart, this is going to work. But even when you have a business model that looks amazing on paper, you can still fail. Because the only judge of your business model is the customer, the market, right? And that's where you need to get out of the building and start testing, just like we've seen in the introductory video. Steve, floor for you.
So, how many of you ever wrote a business plan? Anybody? How many of you got funded from that plan? How many of you think your VCs who funded you from that plan actually read the plan? Yeah. Well, any VCs in the room who want to tell them the truth? Anybody ever spend the hours or days doing the Appendix A in the back? Anybody know what the Appendix A is? Yeah, the forecast? Do you know after writing Appendix A, forecast, income statement, balance sheet, cash flow, 5-year plans, for 40 years in Silicon Valley, that no one ever made the connection, then the only other people ever to institutionalize 5-year plans was the Soviet Union? And we kind of know how that worked out. I still teach that we ought to do business plans in universities, but I now insist they be taught in the English department because they're the best example of creative writing, which all of you probably know. I'm really not here to trash plans, but I am here to tell you that we now know, after decades, and those of you who are on your first or second startups, one simple fact, which Alexander mentioned. No business plan survives first contact with customers. Just can't. As smart as you all are, and by definition you are because you're here and you're running life sciences companies, you are not smarter than the sum of your customers. And that's really hard for first-time entrepreneurs to understand, particularly if you're scientists and engineers. Because, again, by definition, you are the smartest people in the room. And that gets a lot of us in trouble in thinking that we could pre-compute everything about our business. And that's kind of the interesting part about entrepreneurship, because to start a company in face of, seemingly insurmountable and irrational odds, we have to have vision and passion and faith, and we have to be believers. And the mistake a good number of us make, and I made it for a good number of startups, is actually confusing a faith-based enterprise with a fact-based enterprise. Because on day one, every startup, regardless of how much data you have, is a faith-based enterprise. What you quickly need to do, though, is to turn that faith into facts as rapidly as possible. And so what we're talking about here, and what Alexander and I work on, is what is the process for turning faith into facts, so in fact, you actually do have a vision rather than a hallucination, which most startups actually turn out to be, by the way. I mean, if we all kind of understood the statistics of failure and success, these are irrational things we're doing. Well, we do them because we're all passionate about the science, the technology, building business, making something that never existed happen. And so what I teach now is a process that says, look, everything you know on day one, not about your technology, but about your business, about your customers, about your value proposition, about your partners, about your channel and your pricing, great, write it down. Use the business model canvas and write it down. Write it down any way you want, but at the end, you're just guessing. And because we're scientists and engineers, we use a fancier word that says, oh, there are hypotheses. But anywhere else, we'd call them guesses. And other places, we'd call them effing guesses. We're just guessing. And so what we need is a process, some kind of rigor, to actually help us get out and test those guesses and turn them into facts as rapidly as possible. As mentioned earlier, I wrote a book on this, originally something called The 4 Steps to the Epiphany, which launched the lean startup movement, and then a new book called The Startup Owner's Manual. I teach this class at Stanford, Berkeley, Columbia, now Caltech, and last year the National Science Foundation adopted the course as the standard for teaching scientists and engineers who want SBIR Phase 2 grants, that is to commercialize their science and technology. Later this year, ARPA-E is going to adopt the same process for their scientists and engineers. And it's just a simple methodology. There's no magic here. In fact, when you look at it, you'll go, this is it? The problem is that for 40 years, we didn't even do this. And so what I thought I'd do is, rather than just showing you slides of the process, showing the results of one team in an adjacent market that actually went through it. And I'll show you a 2-minute video first, and then I'll show you their presentations of what they learned in 8 weeks. Now, let's see if we can actually run the video and see if we can get that to work. It's 2 minutes. Thanks.
OmegaChem is working on bio-based chemicals. I'm Shivani Garg, the entrepreneurial lead.
I am Peter Keeling, the mentor.
I am Basil Nicolaou, the principal investigator.
We use biomass as our feedstock and ferment it in the lab to make functionalized fatty acids. OmegaChem's task is to scale this process and make bio-based chemicals that can have applications in detergents and lubricants, and thus replace the non-renewable petroleum-based products. When I started this class, I thought technology was the most important thing for starting a company. But as I went through the course, I discovered that getting out of the lab and meeting customers to understand their needs and creating a value proposition was equally important.
The most interesting customer discussions were with Procter & Gamble, where there was considerable interest in our branched molecules aligned with their know-how in detergents and a need to deliver bio-based products.
Although I already knew that branched molecules are valued by detergent companies such as Procter & Gamble, the surprise was that our immediate customers would be surfactant formulators who sell and partner with companies such as Procter & Gamble.
So this was the 2-minute video we made every team do as an introduction to their final presentation. Each one of those teams were made up of a principal investigator, that is a full-time professor. I put up the PowerPoint. Their entrepreneurial lead, which is a graduate student who's working for free, and a local mentor, either an entrepreneur or investor in the industry. And the National Science Foundation has them apply. There's a competitive process to get in, and they select the best of a couple of thousand teams a year that take NSF funding who actually want to commercialize the technology. And what we do is just simply put them through a class. 10 weeks, 8 of it spent just simply testing each part of the business model canvas. Now, if you've kind of processed what Alexander has put up, that canvas is a fun intellectual exercises. Who's my customer and what's the segment and whatever, and if you're great and it's wonderful and it's fun, you got it on the board, okay, I'm done. Not in our class. That's about the first 20 minutes. Because the next 8 weeks of actual work is they spoke to 100 customers. 100. 8 weeks. We're not talking about 22-year-olds in hoodies and flip-flops. We're talking about the average age of the principal investigators, 45. And so we've proved we could still make elephants dance. The last time they've been in front of their peers getting critiqued was probably when they were doing their doctorate. And we take these teams week by week, make them get out of the building, and come back and present in front of the teaching team and their peers for group critique. It's brutal. But the process is incredibly effective. Let me take you through it. As you heard in the video, their original value proposition was they wanted to solve a problem that a petroleum-derived feedstock for surfactants and lubricant industry was non-renewable. They thought they could make sustainable bio-based replacements with biofunctional molecules. We make them do a market-sized estimate. They kind of said, we think it's the surfactant business, about $24 billion. It's growing at about 15% a year. And their position in the value chain was they were going to start on the left with bio-based feedstock and make bio-based chemicals. And they were going to be kind of the supplier in the middle. And here's the business model canvas. We make every team show up on day one, having looked at Alexander's video and gone through his book, and fill out their canvas. And most teams, because they're smart, say, thanks, we're done. What were you going to do the other 9 weeks? And we just kind of sit there and smile. Keep this in mind. A couple things to note is who do they think their customers are on the right? They think it's an existing market. It's going to be the polymer manufacturers and biotech companies. Intuitively obvious, of course. And maybe there's some new market here selling to novel bioplastic companies, obviously. And so those were their hypotheses. First week, they got out of the building and talked to biochemical companies, 15 of them in the first week. How did they find these people? Got out the Rolodexes, LinkedIn, Facebook, conference attendees, business cards, peers in other universities, etc., and they learned how to make cold calls, which, if you've been a scientist and an engineer, is kind of an exciting process. Because to me, if you're a great scientist and engineer, the difference between an introvert and an extrovert is whether you're looking at your shoes or my shoes. And our goal, and some of you aren't laughing, so the rest of you could explain the jokes. And the goal for us is to turn these scientists and engineers into people who can make eye contact and watch people's pupils dilate by the end of these 10 weeks. Because that's what it takes to make a business. And by the way, if you can't be part of a team doing that, you could be a co-founder, but you ought not to be running your company. And so that's the distinction. It's not that we think you shouldn't be part of a company, but if you want to be running one, you need to be able to figure out how to get out of the building and listen to customer feedback. And so the first thing they found out was, instead of polymers, they ought to be talking to surfactant formulators and users. And that came from a customer or a potential customer. And so after a couple of iterations, Their customer segments now still has polymers, but they just added surfactants. And someone said, boy, the biggest market is home and personal care. And they kind of got rid of new markets and multi-sided markets. And they understood now some of the details about their value proposition, all based on customer feedback. How were they going to get from their company to those end users? Well, they needed to test some hypotheses about distribution channels. And so they went out and talked to chemical distributors. And so they talked to 9 distributors and 3 biochemical industry experts who actually have been through this before. And what they learned was, you know, you really don't want to be selling to polymer formulators. There's really very low entry barriers to talking to surfactant formulators because they're looking for green solutions, not petroleum-based solutions. So you guys walking into them should be incredibly easy. They'll welcome you with open arms versus having to compete in the polymer side with petroleum-based solutions where people really didn't care whether it was green or not. And that was a real insight for these guys. So now they updated their customer segments, and they said, we're not talking to the polymer manufacturers or biotech companies. And you know, the customer really is kind of in this value chain. We didn't even realize that. And what's really interesting is we didn't even understand it's pretty important to have a regional supply of surfactant raw materials. So companies didn't have to worry about single source material sourcing. And that was a really big insight. And the fact that green was a big selling point was also a new insight. So they had another hypothesis to test, customer relationships. Could they work with potential customers to co-create an even more powerful value proposition? And so they went out and talked to 4 more companies in the surfactant space, 4 more in the lubricant space, other bio-based companies, another 6. And what they found was surfactant users influenced the formulators. In this case, the users were not end users, but they were companies like Procter & Gamble actually influenced the suppliers. And that's a relationship that they could get in the middle. And that the users were really interested in having green products because their end users were putting pressure on them. Now what they thought was a chemical business and a chemical sale to surfactant users actually started to get into an interesting ecosystem. And so they updated their canvas again, and now they wanted to test, oh yes, perhaps we ought not to be a nonprofit, which is sometimes a problem, and you do all this and you forget the goal was to make money. In fact, every once in a while in a board meeting, I'll suggest probably we should just declare ourselves a 501c3 now. That means nonprofit in technical terms. But in this case, they actually went out and said, can we actually get some orders now before we even develop the product? And so they dummied up a product sheet and talked to 7 surfactant companies, and they had a lot of questions. They knew how much it would cost for the biomass. They kind of understood what it would cost to make a finished detergent and the surfactant pricing, but they really didn't understand some of the intermediate pricing. And when they talked to end users, they were able to fill out that chart. Now they understood the revenue flow and the value chain dollar per dollar. Again, none of this was possible in 10 weeks sitting in your building, regardless of how smart you are, and more importantly, none of this is possible with market research firms. Some of you use market research firms. Come on, some of you admit it. I love them too, because they are the world's best resources for predicting the past. Because let me remind you, if they were great at predicting the future, they'd actually be called hedge funds. So confusing market research with the ability to predict the future, let me remind you, your job is to create the future. And so there's no possibility that market research, I'm just going to beat these guys to death for about another 10 minutes, because I love to see startups coming in and so says the market's going to be X. Well, why don't I invest in them? Because you clearly don't have any idea. Your job is to figure out through first principles what the market's going to look like. Here was a good example. So their other key idea was scale. Not just laboratory, but scale was the key. 500,000 pounds per day. They needed to understand how to get from the lab to that. Huge number. And so they really started to work on the left-hand side of the canvas. Their key activities: production, yield, quality, constant innovation, and key partners. And their partners' hypotheses were going to be biomass suppliers, and they talked to a whole bunch of them. And what they found is, yep, this is what they needed to do. Here are the partners they spoke to. And they found out that, yes, market research was important, but also cheapest biomass suppliers and surfactant users was something they hadn't even thought about as partners. And so what's next? They're going to get state funding for scale. They're getting federal funding for the next generation of SBIR grants. And let me just show you their week-to-week evolution. They went from first business model canvas to the last. Everything in red is what changed from day one. 8 weeks of work, 10-week class. There is no way the stuff in the red could have been invented sitting in the lab. And week by week, it kind of looked like this. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And so that's an example of what business model design and customer development looks like. Hopefully you'll do better in a shorter period of time. The goal is to get out of the building, and I'm happy to answer some questions. So thank you.
Actually, let me take 1 minute to really quickly introduce our expert panel. So you already know Steve and Alex. They're being joined by Zhen Xu, who's founder of MIT's Hacking Medicine, serial entrepreneur, investor, coach, mentor, and Sue Siegel, who's the new CEO of GE's Healthy Imagination division. So thank you for being here.
Hello, everybody. I'm glad it's a room of friendly faces, as they say, as I'm about to experiment with my own personal business model canvas. My name is Joshua Sestak. I'm at the University of Kansas, and we're focusing, my company is Orion Bio. We're developing therapeutics for autoimmune disease. So what we're really trying to do is get away from the current model of just suppressing the entire immune system and looking at treating the disease progression directly. So with that in mind, I told I have 5 minutes, so I'm going to try and go as quick as possible and be as thorough as possible in that amount of time. If that's, so our value proposition is this SAGA. It's a soluble antigen array therapy that we've developed for the treatment of multiple sclerosis. And within this value proposition, what we looked at was the different elements of this therapy that gives us some benefit over the current treatment, which is reducing the side effects, increasing the extended efficacy. So many times these therapeutics become less and less effective over time, as well as prolonging your treatment efficacy and then reducing your dosing schedule. Some of them are IV infusions, which obviously take a long amount of time where you have to sit, or you have to take multiple doses during the day or the week. So with these value propositions, looking at our customer, what we found is, I don't know if you'll be able to read this, but really this is the percentage of people that are experiencing relapsing, remitting multiple sclerosis in the country. In the United States, it's about 85% of the 400,000 people that have multiple sclerosis. But while this is kind of our endpoint customer, really what we need to look at is the relationships that we have of how we can get there. And so we're not going to be able to develop a sales force, and we're not going to be able to talk directly to doctors. What we would need is to have some kind of partnership with big pharma. And so that's kind of these channels of, big pharma is really, it'd be a licensing or merger acquisition that we would go through, and then they can actually talk to the doctors and pharmacies and get to the patients. So for the company ourselves, our key resources that we can develop to date are really the personal, so that's your lab space and the employees and the technology that we have with that, as well as our IP, and then kind of, I tried to include some of this financial incentives that would be, as far as stock options or whatnot for your employees. But as a smaller starting biotech, there are many key partnerships that we would need to go, and that's going to be those contract lab organizations that can complete your animal toxicity studies and complete your IND packet formation and complete all the work and your data maintenance. I mean, you create massive amounts of data, and someone has to be able to organize it or keep it organized. And this is just kind of building towards your first step, which is this, this one yellow over here. I guess there's no laser pointer, but it's the yellow one that is getting to the IND, because in pharmaceuticals, as you all know, the IND is kind of how you can actually validate what you have is real and get into humans. And so the cost structure focuses on getting everything towards that, whether it's your people, your labs, all your tox studies and whatnot. And to do that, kind of these key activities that we developed was getting the treatment therapeutic developed, characterized, getting a nice data packet around that, completing all your animal studies, developing your regulatory packet, getting all your long-term storage and all the necessary things that the FDA wants so you can get into humans, so that you can get to this point of revenue stream, which is hopefully some licensing deal with big pharma, where you can get royalties and milestone payment. And then I kind of put off to the side in those greens, that's kind of the funding that we can use to try and get there, whether it's private sector grants, say from the Multiple Sclerosis Foundation, there's the Myelin Repair Foundation, there's a lot of private entities that like to give money to try and solve these diseases for their patients, or SBIR grants or angel money on these smaller terms. Because, as we try and do these projections, we say, oh, well, we need like $5 million to get to IND. Well, how do you go out and get $5 million? I haven't met anyone on the street that wants to give me $5 million, so if you do, please meet me after the talk. But then it gets more and more complicated as you get past just trying to get to humans. And so as I try to continue building this, really the next thing is, if there's a next there, these are all the added post-it notes that I came up with trying to go through phase 1, and then trying to go through phase 2 as well. And then you just add these activities of setting up, how do you set up clinical sites? How do you set up this? And how can you do it on your own? Or how can you do it with a partnership of big pharma? So that's kind of my presentation. I hope that was 5 minutes or less. I'll take questions and critiques.
Yeah, I'll start. Very nice presentation, thank you, and pretty crisp. And I guess one of the questions I would ask is, as you're thinking about clinical trials in particular, which always is sort of the gulp when you think about this, you've got 4 different sort of endpoints or differentiators that you really want to get to. So the cost associated to that, how are you in fact going to go after one of those in particular, or how are you really thinking about the clinical trial design strategy?
Yeah, see, that is one of the ones where kind of, as Steve was talking, beating the pavement and talking to some of these customers, going to the customers that are in the space that have therapies out there and saying, like, okay, how can we develop our therapy so you want to put it into your pipeline? How can we, there's really only 2 biotherapeutics for multiple sclerosis, and so really saying, how is it that we need to design our studies to interest you? Oh, sorry, I thought I was pretty loud just in general. And those are the questions that we would need to ask, and hopefully as the funding, because, doing a clinical trial is a lot of money.
Right.
And so if we have enough and we have exciting enough data that we can get someone, say venture capital, interested, we would hope that the people that we bring aboard would have expertise enough to guide that as well.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, let me just ask a question. So you have a couple of revenue streams there, but you don't seem to have a customer segment who's paying for those particular revenue streams. Is that?
Yeah, this is the one problem that I kind of had with this model in trying to conceptualize all this. And the same thing, we've worked with the business department or the business school developing business plans for this company. The business models tend to break down for the pharmaceutical companies, trying to generate, okay, what is our profits and what is our revenue stream based on our royalties and our licensing agreement? If we say, well, we have 85% of the population, so we have 320,000 people with relapsing remitting. We want to gain 15% of the marketplace over 5 years after launch, and we have an 8% royalty stream, and that's going to be $2.7 billion a year. So, we have $270 million of cash. It doesn't really work like that. And so when I tried to put the numbers in the model as far as the generator, it just started getting really weird things. And I was like, oh, look, with my current cost structure, even though I'm spending $40 million on clinical trials to get through phase 2, I still have $350 million in the bank. And so I took those out.
No, yeah. No, the reason why I'm asking is before the numbers, there's something really simple, right? People or companies pay if you're solving some kind of pain for them or you're creating some kind of gain. So saying for who are you solving a pain, for which company, for which patient, and for who are you creating a gain is a very basic and important start. And that's what you're going to be testing outside of the building. If those customers are not there, you're saying, well, you know, I don't need to talk to those guys, right?
I guess maybe that's what I was trying to cover with the private sector and SBIR grants. So I mean, the SBIR, you can pitch the National Institute of Health, and the private sector would be, you know, the MS Society or other such organizations. So maybe I could move them up into or straddle the line of customer segment and revenue stream. As, I mean, they would feed cash in to hopefully advance the idea.
One of the things that is the most challenging about life science and what we've found in using the canvas is just it gets so complex so fast, and you have a bunch of moving parts, and thinking about the customer segments, oftentimes you have to, you know, choose one or two players that you're trying to benefit, and I think when I think about what you just presented, it's how do you avoid the decelerants that are, you know, that are so challenging in pharmaceutical design and testing, and how do you accelerate your data? And, you know, what foundation, the good thing about MS is you've got some really strong foundations, and they've done some really great things in terms of pre-collecting samples so that you could test your therapies, you know, on existing samples with confirmed patients. You wouldn't have to enroll a clinical study. Have you kind of thought through that?
Yeah, we're definitely looking at trying to, it's kind of the flip side of this. We can see if we can use the same kind of type of therapy for a diagnostic tool. The biggest thing with MS is we have this big data bank, but from the time to diagnosis, from the time of onset is 9 years usually, because a lot of the initial symptoms are similar to other diseases such as diabetes or just a pinched nerve from. And so how can we also leverage, you know, the technology to help in that space might be another revenue stream that we've thought of. And then another thing, you know, while there's a growing bank of kind of samples to use is the public perception, and trying to, how can you increase the public perception of willingness to donate into that space, and then to influence where the company goes. I think that's an excellent point.
Well, and you know, one of the keys is subsegmenting the disease, right? Subsegmenting based on the natural history of that disease. And then you'll come to some insights for who you can attack based on, you know, if you can diagnose earlier, or, you know, or are you limited to only treating later or with particular comorbidities?
Yeah, I'd love to pick your brain further on those. So. Okay, I'm done.
Thank you, thank you. The next.
Yeah, sure.
So obviously, Josh represented the perspective for therapeutics. The next person is going to be UT Quo, representing the diagnostics vertical.
Thank you, Dominic. Dominic originally submitted 9 slides, but thanks to Dominic, he reduced it to 1. So you only see 1 slide, but I'm going to explain very briefly. My name is UT Quo. My business is Rochester Innovations. My project is the device, handheld mini lab diagnostic device. In my original slides, I have a drawing, but now you have to imagine these handheld medical devices, just like this microphone or like electrical toothbrush, but you are familiar, if you use electric toothbrush, there's a battery. But a few years ago, Philips, they actually come out with electrical toothbrush dispensing toothpaste to the Bristol. And it's very effective. A lot of users like it. So imagine that device is something like electrical toothbrush, but instead of dispensing toothpaste, it's actually dispensing 2 kinds of reagents. That reagent will dispense to the brush head. In this case, we call the test cartridge. The test cartridge inside has a biosensor and also has a reagent imports. And that imports cell sealing, it will not cross-contaminate with what come out from the handle. So, and that test head itself also can put the directory in your mouth. For example, It has a vacuum button. You push the button, then you can suck your saliva into the test cavity. But then in terms of the blood, then the tip of the test cartridge has a needle, so you can get the blood into the cartridge directly. You also can take urine or vaginal fluid that way. So that all depending on the shape of the test head. So that device, the first proposition, it is all-in-one. Actually, it is directly take your sample to the mixing of the reagents, because it vibrates just like electrical toothbrush, it vibrates, it enhances the mixing, and also you display the results. Certainly, you can put a wireless communication with the network. So this is all-in-one device. And there's two major markets. One is the hospital and also the clinics. Hospital can have a device and go to the patient's bed, and it's a point of care. You simply test it and replace for the next patient, because there's a disposable test head. And another market actually is home monitoring for this aged population. They have chronic disease, and they like to have frequent testing. So in that case, your test head can be disassembled and cleaned. So since it's the personal use, you can keep repeating using it. So then there's two revenue streams. One, of course, you sell the device, but most importantly, you sell the refill. For this point of care, it depends on what kind of disease you are testing. So you are, this is a common device, but then you can replace the test cartridge according to the disease you want to test. And that will be low cost because you're dispensing liquid reagent, so it doesn't go through this drying, it becomes a powder. It doesn't require coating, so it is very expensive, and it doesn't require packaging of the individual testing. So it is a very low cost. And for the home care monitoring, and it can be designed, everything is automated. When the cavity is filled with fluid, and then you start to injecting the reagent, everything is automatic. So all this in my patent applications. So very nice, this canvas automatically put the estimate. I have to credit the whole thing because originally simply just device concept, but they forced me to think about all this partnership, etc. And also the estimator give a projection of all the this refill, replaceable cartridge.
You two, we'll let the experts start.
Yes, thank you.
Do you want to go? Go ahead.
Everyone's looking at me.
I'm glad to. I'm glad
you know,
to
one thing that would be helpful is just to have had an idea of the unit, because when you mention needles and vaginas, I just wonder like what the product is exactly.
Different shape, different,
okay.
Different configuration.
Yeah, okay.
Well, and I was thinking, brushing 2 times a day is hard enough. Thinking about diagnosing 2 times a day with the toothbrush sort of element was pretty tough. But my question is the following. It sounded to me like what you're trying to develop is a platform for actually a point-of-care device. And,
yes.
But there's a lot that's sort of dependent for your strategy. One is licensing of the assays, so you're probably going to go towards assays that are already developed.
Yes.
And then 2 is just the distribution channels associated to those. So partnerships in all of this is going to be pretty important from the very beginning. So I'm assuming that's a lot of what you're thinking about in terms of how you're going about building the business.
Yes, I have to learn from Steve. He just talked about, hopefully it's only 8 weeks, talking to the partnership.
Or 8 years, depending on.
Yes. So the great resource will be University of Rochester. That's a great, they have a hospital, they have a lot of doctors. They also encourage entrepreneurship. So they will be a great resource. Yeah, I do need all the help, certainly.
Yeah, because the content licensing portion of this, to be able to take assays that are already pre-developed, since you don't exactly want to do this, or have them actually take on the device and they put their assays on it and they distribute it. I mean, those are considerations in terms of the business model.
Yes, we can imagine that home diagnostic, there are a lot of kits already available. For example, the HIV, they already have a saliva test and they are actually have this home test kit. Then in that case, we can put their reagent into the device And also there's some solid strip. We can make the solid strip in terms of solid powder, but then we make it into, have them make it into a liquid reagent. So a lot of good example can be used. That take time, of course. There's a lot of partnership to be built.
I would like to build on that point
Yeah.
of channels, because I think this is really a business model point. Even without knowing the industry, I can already promise you that you're probably going to have a value proposition to the distributor.
Yes.
So if you don't have the distributor there as a customer segment, just as a partner, you're probably going to fail. You really have to figure out, and then that's where the whole customer development comes in. Yeah.
I recognize that. That's why in my post-it notes in the key partnerships, I do have some companies list there.
They could go in addition on the other side, because you really have to create value for
Right.
them that they're
Right,
even going to
right,
start
right.
thinking of distributing.
Yeah,
Right?
I think this idea is just more licensing.
And Alex, just to build again on Alex's point, when I think about, you mentioned HIV as an example, well, what about the HIV test in the home market makes it that they're going to want yours versus what they already have? And that's what he's really driving at too in terms of the value proposition.
Yes, I think HIV actually require more frequent testing, for example, every week instead of, say, every 3 months. But right now on the market, they put it that way, like now you can allow for several months to test it once. It's very unsafe, actually.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Jay Meng will be representing the medical device vertical.
So my name is Jay Meng. I am a recovering academic. Just got out of school. But, okay, so I cheated a little bit because I really wanted to include some more visuals. I'm here on behalf of ClearTrack, Inc., and we're bringing clarity to breast biopsy. So the first thing that we did was we wanted to actually talk to our potential customer segments, and specifically we reached out to breast cancer radiologists, and we recognized that there was a certain pain point, and that pain point comes during ultrasound-guided needle breast biopsy. During this procedure, it's not a very easy procedure to do. It requires a lot of hand-eye coordination, but on top of that, ultrasound isn't great at visualizing needles, so this makes procedures sort of longer and more difficult. So we thought the value proposition that we could offer as a product, a breast biopsy needle device that has proprietary ultrasound technology baked into the tip. So this is an additional hardware component. And what this technology allows us to do, what you can see on the slide there, before you have an ultrasound image, there's a needle in there, you can't really see it, but once you turn on the, flip the switch, so to say, then you can sort of see right there, that's where the needle tip would be. So we hypothesize, in other words, we just guess, that this will make procedures easier, faster, and safer for patients and ultimately the doctors that are doing these procedures. Our channels would be sort of a traditional medical device channels, such as direct sales, or medical distributors, such as McKesson, Cardinal Health. But then we took another look at the customer segments. So doctors, though they're the ones using these devices, they're not the ones paying for it. And even the places that they work, such as the breast centers, they're kind of, there's money shuffling around with reimbursement and whatnot. But we figured one way to sort of get a hold of the market that we're working with is there are these specialized breast treatment centers in the U.S. There are about 1,000 there, and we figure with a conservative estimate of 5 biopsies per day, a pretty lax schedule of 250 days a year, we're working with something that could be potentially up to a $300 million market. Our customer relationships would obviously, hopefully, to start generating some data on efficacy and safety and efficiency. And as with sort of direct sales, we would have to have account managers and really expert salespeople developing relationships with the doctors and the breast centers that are using our device. Revenue streams, just a few that we've identified so far with this model, would be the direct sales and wholesale rates through distributors. I'm going to speed through the rest of this. Our key activities would be R&D, building a sales team that's not cheap, manufacturing. Resources would be IP, so going back to the technology that's baked into the tip of the needle, that would have to be IP protected, and we're working on the provisional, as a lot of people say. Building the team, clearing the FDA 510K process, not trivial. And then we'd have to really work with a lot of other players to make this work, such as R&D facilities. I'm hoping to work something out with my former university, manufacturers, these sort of key opinion leader MDs, and our distributors. It's going to cost a lot. So just a few off the top of my head are the cost of goods sold. Hopefully we can get it down to the price where it could be disposable. Building a team, people eat. And then the upfront costs, everyone just tells me it's, what, 5 to 10 million just to get something like this off the ground. So again, not trivial. But my hope is that we do create a platform for this technology, so we don't just go after breast biopsy. There's prostate, there's a whole ton of ultrasound-guided interventional procedures that could benefit from enhanced visualization, and that's sort of the blue sky picture that we're trying to sell. And I hope I was good on time, and open to your feedback. Thank you.
I think some of the challenges in kind of healthcare canvases is you've got to sub-segment and figure out where the consumption void is, or the demand void, or a vacuum. So breast centers are using existing technologies. They're doing this all the time. Is there another venue where this would be useful, and they would be able to get reimbursed at the same amount as as some of the breast centers, but actually do it maybe in the office, get a faster turnaround time, and just answer for the patient, which is a big driver. So could you do that at Planned Parenthood or something like that?
That was sort of another thought that we had, that if we can indeed make these procedures easier, so to say, and the doctors I've spoken with, they don't like to hear the term training wheels, but essentially our technology would be training wheels for an otherwise highly skilled procedure. If we could move out of the specialized breast centers and into sort of more so-called point of care applications, offices, even rural health, I think there's a large potential for growth there. I didn't want to sort of be overly ambitious in proposing that just yet, because I have received sort of pushback in terms of proposing to change physician habits, so to say. But ultimately, that's what we want to do.
So a couple of things. One is, I would say even before you start, making sure FTO, freedom to operate, actually exists would be one of the first things I'd encourage. Two is, you talk about this as a sort of device, absolutely, but when I think about, as you put down distributors here, McKesson and Cardinal Health, et cetera, I also think about your co-developers right up front, such as the folks that actually do the needles, and it provokes the thinking of, is it a platform? And so instead of just anything associated to breast cancer, also thinking about guided amniocentesis, for example. So anything associated to needles or any sort of intervention that requires sort of much more precision and guided precision would be potentially a co-development partner. Because something like this could be pretty big if in fact FTO exists, or to go partner with the folks that actually have the IP.
Sure, that was one of the 3 versions that I had submitted, but wanted to take us through this one. But I think that would be, I think we'd like to pursue that as well, just for the mere fact that we don't have to build out a sales team and have this new device. But thanks.
You know, one more point. I guess when you're talking about different specialties and rates of adoption within different specialties, you know, to Sue's point, thinking about orthopedics and even just knee synovium injections of lots of different things where they're doing that in an unguided fashion could be interesting.
Yeah, if I could follow up with you guys to pick your brains some more.
Can I just, very quickly, Dominique, I know you're looking at time, but is this a purely transactional model, so you sell once, it's over, or is this some kind of recurring revenues? Because, that can be very interesting to look at.
We've sort of played around with that in terms of the one and done disposable versus the razor blade model, where we sort of give away the handle and make our money on the sort of business end. So to answer your question, I think that's the one example we've thought of so far in terms of recurring revenue. But definitely, if we can come up with more and sort of think this through a little more, that would be helpful for us. So, thanks.
Cool.
Steve, if you want to give us the take-home message, you can close the session for us. Thank you.
Thank you.
So one of the dangers, and one of the great news about the business model canvas, as you could see, it really helps you focus on the things you need to think about what do you know versus what you don't know. But the examples we saw today were nothing more than how to do my business plan in nice different colors with stickies. And if that's all you're going to use the business model canvas for, don't bother. Alexander, do you agree?
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's just a waste of time. So if what you felt was, gee, it's really nice and it's good and we accomplished something, let me tell you, you accomplished nothing. You just simply, instead of typing paragraphs, just used yellow stickies. Because not one of those people up here mentioned a single fact. What you told me were all your opinions, which were hypotheses, which is a great starting point, but no one said, and let me tell you how I'm going to go out and validate these hypotheses. So what you essentially have is another business plan just formatted in a different way. And I'm not suggesting this isn't a bad start. It's exactly the perfect start, but it is the first step. And I wanted to contrast that to the work you saw that team did in 8 weeks of getting out of the building. The business model canvas is the first 2% of the work, 2%. And if you're not committed to do that, then you will typically do the other standard startup process of burning cash, burning time, burning engineers, etc., as you stumble in learning this, and eventually converge on a solution through lots more cash or go out of business. The combination of the business model canvas and customer development, we now know after a decade of doing this, I guarantee you, over a portfolio, helps startups fail less. I can't guarantee you it will help your startup succeed more, but it's just logical if you think about it. Spending the time, stop telling us your opinion, and admit that you simply don't know. And here is the list of things you need to go find out. I just want to make that absolutely clear, that if for you to make and get value out of this process, what you just saw in those canvases is the organization for a long journey outside the building. The other thing I just want to observe is the other thing is that what it does for the first time, do you remember that series of 8 canvases? Does everybody remember that? For the first time in the history of entrepreneurship, we now have a time-lapse movie of the entrepreneurial journey. For the first time ever. Because if you're a great entrepreneur, what you do is you typically declare your current business model the one you always had. Gee, I've always thought this. And next week when you find something better, well, I thought this. Now, for the first time, it lets you see the path from where you started to where you are. And sometimes, because you need to backtrack, it allows you to keep track of that. So my suggestion to you all, business model canvas, but then get out of the building and start doing customer development. So thank you very much, and I appreciate your time.